And over to you, Clive.
Welcome everybody. This is our third challenge seminar for UNA Greater Lincolnshire. And I'm pleased to welcome Jane Salt. Jane Salt is the best lady golfer I've played with and against in my career as a golfer. And it's through conversations we've had as you go around a golf course that you end up with an identification of similar agendas. And I'm really pleased to invite Jane to lead us out tonight. She'll say a little bit about herself and her background, and she won't be, she'll probably quite unassuming in that. But in terms of our work tonight, I shall also invite you to do some homework afterwards. So that's a step into the next stage. So thank you, Jane, for doing our lead out presentation tonight, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll start screen sharing my presentation in a moment. Brief background is that most of my working life has been spent in primary education, from starting as a mature student with young children to becoming a head teacher of quite a diverse large primary school, and then joining the local authority as a school improvement advisor. For the last few years I have tried to go into semi-retirement and do a bit of independent consulting and a little bit of school inspection on the side. I am quite surprised that Clive's introduction also included what I like to do for fun, which is why I did go into semi-retirement, but hopefully we can explore some of the challenges at the moment that are facing education. And I think it's particularly pertinent today because it's the anniversary of the very first lockdown a year ago, when I think I had a very full working diary. Schools were very busy places getting to grips with some of the new requirements in terms of how they're rated, and it went from full steam ahead to nothing. And I think the last year has seen quite a lot of changes. So I'm going to make an effort now to do my screen share, and I seem to have, there it is, I think. That's it. So hopefully this will work. So the theme for this evening is sort of where are we now, how have we got here, where are we going, and what are the challenges that face us in education. And I think Clive is quite right that we all have some knowledge because we've all been to school. Some of us have spent a lot of our adult lives in there as well. And as parents, that there is that link, isn't there? You'll forgive me if I just go over a few of the sort of basics in terms of the background, because I wasn't quite sure on the audience. So I'll just quickly run through how the quality of education is currently evaluated. Schools are encouraged very actively to look at their own performance and find ways of evaluating how well they're doing. Sometimes this is based on, just looking at themselves, what's happening, what's going well, what are the challenges. A lot of schools these days are seeking support and critical friendship with their neighbouring schools or colleagues that have things in common. Of course, there is local authority monitoring, but since my days with the local authority, that's become more of a desktop exercise than it perhaps used to be. And so a lot of the current sort of requirements are based on that well-known Ofsted inspection regime, which is based around an inspection framework. And over the last 30 years, this has been developed. And I think there's now quite a significant reliance on the education inspection framework to benchmark performance. What I would say is that my first Ofsted inspection as a teacher in the early 90s lasted a week. These days, it's a very much more refined process, very much tightly focused. And I think with the sort of technology that's available, we're seeing more and more remote monitoring, because schools themselves are doing a lot more in terms of their own self-evaluation. I think one of the things that we ought to remember, though, is a saying that I came across quite early in my career, and it's stayed with me for some time, and it's something I go back to quite regularly, and I think quite pertinent for tonight. Not everything that is measurable counts, and not everything that counts is measurable. So I think we do have to be quite careful about how we approach measuring what schools and educators do. So the current challenges are around standards, curriculum. The new phrase is cultural capital, and being able to prepare children, pupils, young people for the next stage of their education and the workplace. We've had a time where a data focus was very much front and centre, and I think it's fair to say that it did lead to a narrowing of the curriculum in some ways. The current frameworks very much focus on the breadth and quality and relevance of the curriculum. And I think also acknowledge a lot of things that are harder to measure, such as the requirement for children and young people to develop resilience, self-regulation and self-discipline in terms of not only their learning, but the way that they develop into young citizens and future adults. We talk a lot about schools being safe places to make mistakes, and yet we're surrounded by the social media arena, which is not always a safe place. And I think this links quite well to some of the things that were raised in Bert's presentation last month on peace, justice and strong institutions. And I think the message that we should be taking from that is that schools need to be strong institutions where they can support the young people to be able to manage this, this wealth of information that is at their fingertips and make sense of it. Thinking about what schools are doing to meet the current challenges, well, of course, we have to continue the focus on basic skills, because pupils do need to achieve standards that are appropriate to their age if they're going to be able to cope in an adult world and in the workplace. The curriculum already has quite a heavy load, and my personal view is that schools don't necessarily need new initiatives because they already have plenty, and many schools will sign up to various awards so that they can sort of measure how well they're delivering a particular part of the curriculum. For example, Healthy Schools was one that was very much leading the way some years ago, and now we have Eco Schools, Science Marks, Art Marks, Technology Awards, and one that's very relevant to our association, the UNA, is Rights Respecting, which very much talks about young people having a voice that they can use, but also understanding the responsibilities that go along with them developing into citizens of the future. Cultural capital is a relatively new term, and it is all about understanding key values, learning about the past and present, and the impact possibly of previous actions, which is quite relevant as we're talking about how we can address the Sustainable Development Goals going forward over the next 10 years or so. The current challenges are partly being met through different activities, but with very much a personal and social education underpinning it, and also values education. So we might get schools who are watching daily news round, for example, in primary schools to find out what's going on around them in the world. Thematic learning links knowledge and understanding. For example, thinking back to last month's presentation, a social justice theme could include learning about people like Elizabeth Fry and Robert Peel, exploring democracy and the rule of law and the social values and social constructs that support those things. In terms of preparing children for their next stage of education and work, I think this is a very important aspect, and certainly as an integral part of the curriculum, a relevant curriculum, a broad curriculum. It's something that schools inherently have been teaching for many years, but I think it's something that there's an expectation that it at the moment will be much more visible. And I think this links quite well with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. In terms of preparing children for their next stage of education and work, we've got to consider academic standards, we've got to consider confidence and resilience, and we've got to consider the sort of liaison that is needed for children to transition from one particular institution to another, or into the workplace. We do find, or I personally have found in my work with very many schools, and when I say very many, over the last 10 years, probably hundreds of schools that I've visited, a lot of work is done in the primary sector to prepare children very much for the next stage in education, and to encourage them to think about big questions and try and find ways of working them out, which I always find fascinating, talking to children or observing children whilst they're wrestling with some of these really big ideas. But I do think it's very necessary if we're going to tackle big problems into the future. So where do we want our children to be in 2030? Well, I think it's quite clear that they need to have a good understanding of the global challenges. And I think, to be fair, many schools make sure that children have got a good idea of what is going on around them in the world. I think possibly this last year has rather narrowed the tapestry of what's going on, because there's been such a focus on COVID. But in general, I think through the geography curriculum, through learning about history, through thinking about what's happening in their community, and through learning about British values, I think they do get a good spread of knowledge. I think the challenge for us really is to know how that fits into some of the big challenges that face us globally into the future. I think one of the things that has to be considered is this openness to personal change when we're finding solutions. They can be very daunting problems, can't they? And for a young person who hasn't got the life experience of those of us who are meeting tonight, might well find the whole thing a very theoretical idea, that they wonder how they're going to face the future if these are the challenges that they have to overcome. And I think one of the things we can do is to promote the idea of small personal acts leading to a large collective impact, and to try and make a cultural shift from somebody who is a consumer in society to somebody who's a contributor in society. And to use one of Clive's phrases, move from me to we. We all know, I think, that cultural shift is quite a difficult thing to achieve. And it's only possible really via a well-informed population who are actually well prepared to make changes that will have that larger, longer standing impact. So in my view, I think we need to see young people as potential agents for change. They have to be able to find out about the world, gather reliable information, and be able to test that out. I think we all have heard about fake news and that sort of thing. So it's learning the skills that they need in order to be able to sift through the mountains of information that are available these days and start to make sense of it. It's about trying to find all the pieces and then make a coherent sort of picture from the information that they find. And I think that in itself is a challenge. When I was sort of researching some of the things that children might learn about at the moment, it's surprising how diverse the information is and how different it is depending where you go to for it. I think also they need to talk about the challenges, and so they need the communication skills to be able to do that, and they need to be able to learn to be active listeners rather than just talkers about this, because it's about pooling ideas, it's about finding solutions that are workable, it's about listening to other people and thinking about their ideas, and ultimately reaching a consensus which will help them to make plans and move forward. I think children, young people are capable of doing this in the right environment, and I think it's one of the things that schools can do within the existing curriculum without having to have additional bolt-ons, but it does need carefully thinking about. So in terms of Clive's call to action, if not you, then who? If not now, then when? I think this is something that is very relevant to children and young people, and we can only hope to encourage them to look outward, look widely, be careful in terms of how they accept information and to test it out, and to consider the small things that they can do that would make collectively a large impact and help to move us towards a solution to some of the big challenges at the moment. So at that point, I'll pause, because it may be a point where people want to pick up in terms of ask some questions or to give some views. And I've got a couple of slides further on that we could use if we want to. So are you happy to do that, Bert?
That's fine, Jane. Thank you so much. When we were kind of thinking through this, I think it was important, first of all, to set the scene of where we are now. And I think you've done that really well, Jane. So there's a prescription there and around a curriculum model and a school model and a measurement model, I guess. But I think there's some expertise in the room here that have, I suppose, experiences of what has been the outcomes of that in all sorts of ways. And I'd just like to invite people to say, well, is that sufficient? Are we doing enough? What else is there? What else is there in this context of this post-COVID world? What aren't we addressing? And you know, where are things that we need to challenge others to think about? Can I invite people to make comments?
Can I make an observation?
Is that Russell? Thank you.
Yeah.
Just so you know when you start. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, it's Russell. Yeah. I work extensively in further education, so most of my work is in colleges post 16. And what you find is that the problem I find when I'm talking to educators is that they always structure things around a formal curriculum formula arrangement. And one of the things that you do see, particularly in further education, because it's open to all walks of society, is that there is a whole life learning desire from a wide breadth of people across society, and particularly in the aspect where I work in climate change and sort of climate risk mitigation. You do find that there's a lot of people who recognise the problem of climate change but don't really have the solutions, and they come to the college looking for that solution-based approach, and it's not always there. And so I just wonder what the view is about this, the sort of opening up education to sort of be more than just the formal 9 till 3:30 environment, and it's a more of a whole life experience that people need to embrace and take on, because the changes that we're facing now, whether it's with COVID, whether it's with climate change, have never been experienced by anybody before. These are brand new to the world. So it's a question of how do you grab hold of those changes. And the worst aspects that I see of this is the climate anxiety, or the anxieties that come into youngsters because they don't have the solutions. They see the problem, they don't have a solution. And it's how do you sort of help that whole agenda go forward in a slightly different way.
Well, I think Clive and I were talking about that earlier today, actually, and one of the challenges, I think, is it's not just about teaching children, it's about involving families and the different generations, because for example, a 10-year-old child could have quite a good understanding of some of the problems that they're facing, but without the support of their parents, the smaller things that they could do, just take recycling, for example. It's something that all of us could do probably better than we are doing if the infrastructure was there. But for a 10-year-old child, it needs to have the support of the family and then the wider community. And I think you're quite right. It is a challenge because we're all very aware of the problems, but not the solutions, because the problems are so large, aren't they? Yes. And it's trying to break them down into something that is rather more manageable. And I think, I believe Phil is somebody who is very much involved with children who have complex needs, and to try to unpick it into something that is less confusing and more accessible is one of the challenges. And I'm pretty sure that within the curriculum that exists, we have got the information going in, but it's how we present that. And I think the other point you made about it shouldn't all be teaching, it should be reflecting, it should be exploring. And I think schools are very much under pressure time-wise, and probably no more than now, where everybody's talking about catching up. And yet, we've still got this big agenda.
Okay. Lindsay was going to say something.
Yeah, I wonder if I could just come in. I work for the Diocesan Board of Education, which means we work with our church schools within the Lincolnshire Diocese. And I just wanted to pick up really on what Jane said about that agents of change, because as part of the church school inspection, the SIAMs, that changed recently to be in line with Ofsted. It's much more robust than it used to be. And we don't use the phrase agents of change, but courageous advocacy. Yeah. And it's that idea of, actually, and I think this is a little bit, Russell, about what you were saying, it's not just about the curriculum. And it is, and even in the SIAMS framework, it is about that whole community, as Jane said. It's not just about what goes on in the classroom. And there's some great resources out there for primaries and for secondaries to allow them to do that. There's the Global Neighbours Scheme. There is the Archbishop of York Youth Trust Leaders Award, and they're not just for church schools. They're amazing, that really, because it's not just about the child in the school, is it? It's about, as they grow up, what are we putting in them that actually, because they're not going to be in school in 2030, some of them, many of them, all of them probably. And it's about what we instill in them now to push that forward, which I think is really important.
I think you're right, and I think one of the things as well that we have to remember is that children learn what teachers know, And it's also about making sure that teachers are up to date with the developments and those sort of things. And you know, I do have a lot of sympathy, because at the moment the teachers are spinning a lot of plates. They don't need any more in that respect. But we have to be careful that we're not teaching an outdated view of the world as well. It's about keeping up with current information. And I think because there's so much of it, it's about sifting through to make sure that what we're actually presenting to children is accurate and meaningful. I think also we have to consider that an individual's personal bias is created by their own experience. You know, if you live in rural Lincolnshire, you'll have a very different view on some of these big challenges than you would if you were in a city, Birmingham, for example, or if you were, as one of our number knows, coming to live in this country from somewhere else, because they're escaping a regime that is, to say the least, very challenging. And I think all these different factors make it even more complex, don't they? And also we've got to be careful about the news bias, because we're very used to seeing how that it can be presented in quite a sensational way, but actually we need the facts, don't we? And I think the other thing is to be careful not to be always dwelling on the negative, because people assume the worst, and extremes are sometimes smaller than we think. And to be solution focused, maybe we need some optimism.
Just going to ask, there's other people here that is that Phil? We had a long conversation the other day, Phil, about when the wheels fall off education for young people. What is it that helps them get back on again? And in terms of alternate provision, which you're involved with heavily, are there things that we need to learn from that around what happens for the mainstream, as it were?
Yeah, quite possibly, Clive. You know, we find it's a lot of our work is relational, trauma-informed practice. You know, rebuilding relationships, self-esteem, confidence before we even come to a relevancy of curriculum or target setting or, you know, standards even. You know, so there's very much a mixed picture there, but there's, you know, I can see some huge potential for certainly my young people that are accommodated in my settings. And you know, we're at the very early stages of our journey in exploring this, and it started off as something almost quite inaccessible and unknown, if I'm honest, to doing a little bit of research and joining a few dots and making a few connections and thinking, well, actually, we could make quite a difference with this, and this could have quite a significant impact on their lives and, you know, their outlook and their futures. So, you know,
this is
going
in relation to Sustainable Development Goals.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. Okay, well, that's an interesting concept, because I forgive me for saying so, but I did circulate a paper to a few people some while ago that I wrote around, if you turn the curriculum inside out and said, okay, we've got to learn maths and physics and French because they're the building blocks of how we communicate knowledge. Is there any way of saying, well, what are those building blocks being used to do? And I know that, for example, Clifford's involved in projects around the world with science and technology. So is it about bringing more of the world agendas into focus to say we're learning this because we're going to solve this problem or address this problem? That could be a behavioural issue. I'm very conscious that if you look at the data on COVID, for example, and the social class or the cultural BAME communities that have been hardest hit by COVID, are there things in education that should be being done to address some of those issues? For example, if it's social class, is it about how you provide an education for kids to get better jobs? Well, that's not necessarily going to be the answer, I would think. So what is it you're doing within those settings that empowers them to be you know, more resilient towards whether it's this pandemic or others? So there's some addressing issues there for that. And the other question I was going to ask, and I know Ray there was with some background on international education, to what extent is there such a thing as a national curriculum? If we're looking at a national curriculum, why is it that people critique the English curriculum and say, well, where is Black history? Where is the bigger history of this, as opposed to the more selective stuff that we put in there? I don't know if those resonate with people in the group.
I think we're seeing quite a divergence between the curriculum in England and the curriculum in Scotland and Wales, particularly. Scotland as a result of the Donaldson Review, and Wales, so far as I can gather from what they copied from Scotland, which was as a result of the Donaldson Review, and the emphasis on global education and on the Sustainable Development Goals, very evident now in Scotland and in Wales. I suspect much less so in England. From our experience, the first struggle is really teachers understanding about the Sustainable Development Goals, that they exist, and that we have an obligation under 4.1 to be teaching about them. Once we're through, in terms of what we do, once we're through that barrier, the degree of inventiveness, which it always has astounded me as a teacher, and then not being a teacher, the degree of inventiveness in schools continues to impress me. Just as you were talking, I was looking at something we got as a result of our course. Of course, we finished a Lincolnshire course actually last week, introducing the global goals through remote learning themed tasks. Now, to come up with remote learning themed tasks for the global goals, and then to carry out this with kids who look like me, looking at the pictures, look to me in the top end of Key Stage 1, I would say. It's pretty impressive, really. But to get to that point, we have to know about the global goals, and we have to know then that there's some material available, and whoever this teacher was has quoted quite a lot of external sources in order to get over some pretty simple tasks that kids can carry out at home whilst they're at home under lockdown. Inventive stuff, full of admiration for that sort of thing. But as I started by saying, to begin with, we have to get over the struggle of, do you understand about the global goals? You know what they are, and you know that we do have an obligation to integrate them into the curriculum.
Thank you, Ray. It's interesting how I seem to remember when the national curriculum came in, Ireland, and I know Bert's from that area, I don't know if it applied to him when he was over there, they went back to front, and the whole, what were then the cross-curricular themes were seemed to be more important than the subjects. And in England, it went math, English, science, technology. And in Ireland in particular, it was about social relationships. It was all the other things that went around, environmental stuff that was part of that, the other agendas that were there. And that they are those are the kind of things that we're facing now in terms of our own world settings. In terms of just asking another question in the context of relevance, and Jane talked about progression or transition to the next phase or into life. Is there sufficient understanding of people moving through the system that says, well, I can take on an adult role at 18? They're even talking about bringing the democratic vote down to 16. Now, in terms of the knowledge base for making informed decisions about life and and what goes on, is what we're offering and the outcomes that we're measuring sufficient for managing any change such as that in terms of role of work and life and learning and earning and consuming? There's a big one. Tim, I don't know if you can hear us. Tim, I've known on and off for perhaps nearly 35 years. And I think he was one of the first person I taught when I came to Brig. It's interesting how, if you reflect on your experiences over your life in what you're doing, Tim's a lawyer, I think. I know he's a lawyer. How do you respond to the kind of things we're talking about?
Hi. Gosh, there are issues, aren't they?
Well, how are you with
sort
the
of
hearing you?
contemplating it, right? I'm just trying to contribute a great deal at the moment, Clive. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can now. Yeah.
Oh dear. Yeah.
Oh,
So I know much covered that. So yes, I'm absorbing it. I'm taking it all down. Yes. Thoughts to say.
Okay, well, we'll hold it. We're struggling to hear you, Phil, Tim. So we'll move. We'll come back to you. Clifford, I don't know if you're there. Just directing towards yourself. You work with an organisation which is Global Biotechnology Transfer, and part of that is an educational process around the world. Is there such a thing as a world education then?
Yeah, I think what's most important is the ability for children to interact with each other. And one of the problems I think that we're going to come out of COVID is the fact that children have not been able to mix and interact over the last year. And that's going to be a vital part of their education missing. The ability to find knowledge because of the internet, because you can just Google it, etc., which is a very recent phenomenon, fills in a lot of gaps. But people's ability to communicate with each other and take a settled view of things is a completely different matter. And that's the part that concerns me. And somebody mentioned the sort of role of the family earlier on. I think Jane was mentioning that it was not just the children, it was involving the families and having that infrastructure around you. And it's those parts that I know when I've traveled and I've been talking to people, they make all the difference. The actual technical education can come very, very quickly. And the ability to use digital means to do that is tremendous now. But the fundamentals, I know from being a very young child, I can name all my teachers. I can tell you the influences they all had on my life, and then they markedly changed what I did and how I thought about things. So it's that part that certainly over the last year children have been missing big time. But I'm certainly very grateful for the education I had, which was very varied and went all over the place. And to this day, I can tell you things I do in every day of my life that I can root right back to a teacher probably 50 or 60 years ago. So.
Okay, just picking up on the bit about knowledge and access to knowledge. To what extent, when we look at the news and we look at how people respond to the news and the issues around whether it's extremism or whether it's about particularities around do we or don't take a vaccine, to what extent are the processes that we support through an educational process giving that clarity of view or the ability to make discerning judgments?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on how schools decide to deliver the curriculum, because although you may think it's quite prescriptive if you're not involved, there is actually quite a lot of flexibility about how it's delivered, and I think that is quite a pertinent part to consider, because I think depends on the context of the school as to what decisions are made, for example, about how to pitch learning and how to sort of package it up so that it becomes something that will engage children and be relevant to their particular context. I could give you an example of one school that I work with quite regularly, as they have done a lot of research into the sort of demographics of their pupils, and they feel that one of the challenges is that children don't get very far beyond their own community in the normal course of events in their daily lives, that they may go somewhere on holiday, but that would be an isolated 2 weeks in the year. To get on a plane, they'd go somewhere, and it's very difficult then to sort of to link that to what they're used to on a day-to-day basis, because it's so very different. And what they do, they watch the daily news round every day, and they have that part of their curriculum to do with British values and that sort of thing. It's all packaged up so that they start with, what does the news say? Should we believe everything we hear? let's find out what's happening in that country. Let's find out more about the context of this piece of information. And they make a very deliberate pathway to model for children how they find information and what they do with it when they've got it. I work with another school where it's in a, let's say, a much leafier sort of context, and they are very keen for children to have their voice, and have decided to use the United Nations Rights Respecting, the UNICEF programme. And we have a lot of very articulate children at quite young ages who are writing letters to MPs and getting engaged with local councillors about local projects. So I think we can see examples of things happening that may on the surface look quite different, but actually the underlying aims and intentions are not dissimilar.
Right, okay. Can I just ask them, I know David was involved, certainly with myself, in education post-16 for many years. Do you think we measure the right things, David?
Okay, I want to say some other things, but I think in our day, I don't think they measured the right things at all. But it leads on to something else I wanted to say, and that quality of education is number 4 on the Sustainable Development Goals. It's clearly fundamental, because without that education, you can't actually do much. I mean, education. Without that, you can't address those other issues. And that leads me to not so much the curriculum, but schools now are completely different to schools when I was in school, and even when I started my teaching career. They're much bigger in many ways. They go beyond the school gates in amazing ways, and COVID has illustrated that. But it still hasn't overcome the inequalities. It's the inequalities that are the real problem, because teachers can work very, very hard, but unless you can address the inequalities in a much wider way, it's not going to pick up the key issues. And you could apply that to Lincolnshire, you could apply that to Grimsby, but you can apply it across the world. And if you applied it across the world, then you can see people who get very little education at all. And without that, then they're not going to develop the understanding. So I just wonder about not so much the content of education, but actually how you address the inequalities. It's a very hard thing to do, but I don't know if anyone's got any, and obviously very quickly becomes political, but how to make it a general discussion, because it's not easy to do that. I think perhaps the school, Jane, you referred to, the first school, perhaps in the less leafy area, that actually has a much more difficult challenge to actually address those issues. And in my experience, I don't think the inspection regime actually gave enough credit for that. It was more about results. I think nowadays, perhaps things are changing, and that's to be welcomed.
Well, what I would say is, having been involved in the inspection sort of system for some years now, there has been quite a significant shift with the new education inspection framework, that there's a much greater focus on the quality of the curriculum and the learning, rather than just the data. And whilst there is still a very significant expectation that schools should strive to ensure that pupils reach the appropriate minimum standards for their age, that there's more time spent exploring on the quality of the curriculum that they are learning, and the way that it's put together, and how it addresses some of those inequalities that you're talking about. It really is a much more integral part than it used to be. I'm not suggesting for a moment it's perfect, but I think that there are more opportunities to explore those things.
Yeah, and clearly there's a limit to what schools per se can do.
Yes.
Because much of our education is actually outside of schools. So it's actually about society as well.
But I think also, when I first started teaching, what you were expected to teach was a relatively small package of information, if you like, and knowledge. The curriculum has broadened and grown, and I think that reflects the easy access to information, because I think these days, if you used to live in rural Lincolnshire a couple of 100 years ago, the sum total of the knowledge that you would gain over a lifetime would be what a broadsheet newspaper publishes every Sunday. Mm-hmm. And now, I'm as bad as everybody else. I never think twice if there's something I don't know. I'm straight on to Google and see what I can find. And I think just that whole wealth of information has changed the whole landscape, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think that's certainly a key approach to actually encourage people to their own research, what they do. It's like when we had the Falklands War, I had to quickly go and find out where the Falklands were.
Yeah.
And people don't stop. You teach people to do that throughout their lives.
Yeah. And whereas a family might have owned an encyclopedia, and you pour through that, it's even just, get your phone out.
Yeah.
There. And I think really it's about trying to not exactly strip it all back, but to be really clear about what the fundamental part of it, of the learning is about, and how that will form a really good building block for the next bits of learning that go along.
I've got no doubt that COVID has shown that schools are so critical. I hope after COVID that perhaps society in all areas will see how important schools actually are. Mm. They can't do everything, but they do play a key role.
Well, I'd like to think that because parents have had to be very actively involved in helping their children learn during the lockdown, that it's helped them to have a greater understanding of not only just the content, but the structure of the learning. I'm thinking about it not only as somebody who has had lengthy discussions with head teachers about the challenges of online learning and remote learning and this sort of thing, but I'm just thinking about also the youngest generation in my family, that they're just starting school, and how the parents are dealing with this. And we've got, my family does have a number of teachers in it, and even they find it quite challenging, because it might not be quite their area, or they don't teach that age group. And hopefully the experiences, frustrating and difficult as they probably have been, will help to give greater understanding about how learning is structured and takes place, and the challenges that go alongside it.
I think that could be a small benefit from that. I think
probably not like it at the moment, but I think it possibly is, yes.
If I can just move us on to just a slightly broader view from the technicality and the learning processes. Our remit, or one of our challenges, is to develop new thinking and new actions around sustainable development goals. Ray has mentioned the fact that Scotland and I think Wales have gone down that route, and I'm aware of that from some things I read a little while ago. Italy, I'm told, has put the sustainable development goals as the core of their curriculum. New Zealand, where my son works, have identified that as being the ways in which they're going to shape their curriculum. And the phrase was, we learn things that's important to learn, decided by somebody else. That's what the phrase my son gave me. And where he's looking at climate change or issues around Maori culture, in New Zealand, or his issues around inequality over there. He said, if you face that, you'd want to learn about it. And so if we're looking at polluting the oceans, or the issues around CO2, we talked about that in a previous discussion, or we're looking at peacekeeping, or we're looking at all the other sectors. You know, the guy across the road I went for a walk with recently, who was an ex-agronomist, I asked him about what he was doing for the fields over the last period of time. He said, yeah, I made a lot of money and had a good living selling stuff that I shouldn't have done. You know, he was not having to face it as our children's children will face. So what is it we are doing now, or what is it could we be doing now to put those things more central in our learning?
I think it's surprising, at least in the UK or in England, how poorly SDGs are represented in the curriculum. And perhaps that's something we could lobby for. Perhaps that was something we could encourage.
Okay.
I think elements of them are very present in the curriculum, but I don't, as I sort of alluded to earlier on, the pieces are there, but it's about pulling them together to make the full picture. And that, I think that's the challenge. It's not saying to schools you must do something as well. It's about saying, what are you already doing, and how can you make the concept of the SDGs more prominent and you know, particular rather than general
and relevant, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else wish to make a contribution towards that?
I would think one of the things which could be very important is the element of collaboration with youngsters outside of this country, because you've mentioned several countries there where the approach to the SDGs is different and perhaps more prominent than here. For youngsters to be involved in collaborating, and I don't mean being mobile, but simply collaborating virtually through platforms such as e-twinning, is absolutely crucial. It gives them another view of the world outside what can be some, you know, quite small and quite restricted communities, and it's another means of social interaction which has rules of its own, which I think we're all learning now, and I think they'll certainly have to learn in future. The very sad thing is that as of the 1st of January, quite a few vehicles for that collaboration were abruptly terminated when we decided not to remain in Erasmus. So many youngsters right across the country had the huge disappointment of when they got back to school, or at least began to talk to their teachers, that their e-twinning folders had been deleted. They don't exist any longer. And that was a governmental decision. And the programme, I don't want to get political, but I will, the programme that the government put in place, Turing, which they erroneously called an exchange programme, is a one-way, non-reciprocal programme that encourages mobility, and it doesn't encourage mobility with countries that don't require much CO2 to be burnt, like the Netherlands or France. They encourage mobility to anywhere in the world for, I guess, relatively privileged groups of youngsters. And that's what we've got in place of Erasmus, except in Northern Ireland, where the Republic is kindly paying for Erasmus for them. And we hear today that in Wales, domestic funding, £63 million, is being put into an Erasmus-like scheme, which is going to encourage a reciprocal approach that's lacking in the Turing scheme. That was quite political, wasn't it? Sorry.
Well, it's factual. So it's if it's a fact, it's if there's no reply, it's one of those things, isn't it?
Yeah.
I know we're conscious. I'm conscious of we're running out of time here, Bert, aren't we? And just, you know, in terms of summing these things up, the challenge for me in terms of my own setting is, if I'm talking to my granddaughter in 10 years' time and saying I've done something that made a difference, I would feel okay. My personal challenge will be that if I'm in a position in 10 years' time and I've done nothing, well, why not? And so there's a bit of homework I want to invite you to do. And that is that if you have the opportunity to be the most powerful person in education, in this post-COVID world, in this context of building back better, and in the context of the wider SDGs or the 2030 SDGs, what 3 things would you seek to change within compulsory education, the 13 years that we offer in England now? What 3 things might you want to change or more of what we do? What arguments would you give for that? And how would you measure the impact? And I'm going to ask you if you're able to do that. So it's what 3 things you might change, what arguments you might put for that, and how you measure the impact, so that we could write something up and we could post it somewhere, or we could send it to people, or we could lobby, as someone has mentioned, to say these things we think are important in order that our grandchildren in 10 years' time will be in a better place. If you could do that, that would be brilliant. And we could see it as another part of our remit as a new thinking and new action agenda. I think I'll need to hand over just to Shane for a vote of thanks. Is that right, Shane?
Yes, yeah. Can I just say, Jane, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really good and gave us an insight. I think as a parent of young children, I certainly empathise with teachers over the last year, and it's kind of pushed us all into becoming teachers in our own way. And I think if that's something that we can take on board for the future, then I think that's only a positive, and I think that can really help push the education of this, which we feel is an important matter and is an important matter. And I think what you said there about small personal acts, that will really help us face a big challenge that we have with engaging with young people in making a difference. So thank you very much, and thank you to Clive and Bert for organising the meeting as well. I think it's been good, and hopefully by picking up on those points that Clive made at the end, that we can make a difference and we can start to reflect on that in the future. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.